I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to give any context, but at some point while playing the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, I was presented with this screen. Naturally, I followed the game's instructions and adjusted the slider. In doing so, I got to sit and appreciate just how nice this slider is. You can click on any part of the slider to travel to that point, nice. It handles the edge cases of dragging too far to the left and right, that's pretty cool. It has this little arrow on the top that you can grab and manipulate, and that feels very tactile and neat. This newfound appreciation made me notice how many other things Ultra Deluxe does right in its UI widgets, and UI design in general. I'm NotExplosive, professional game developer and UX complainer, and here's why the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a masterclass in UI design. Since we've had graphical user interfaces, we've had UI widgets. We have been refining this craft to make them as accessible and usable as possible. And yet, basically every video game gets them wrong. In software, you can leverage the operating system to get your widgets, but in games, you have to make everything yourself. And as such, you have to reinvent decades of research and refinement that got us here. It shouldn't have to be this way, right? Like if you're using a game engine, it should come packaged with UI widgets that are ready to use. And Unity, which Ultra Deluxe is made in, does come packaged with a UI system, but all the widgets are really bad, but that's a different video. We'll focus mainly on the settings menu because that's where most of the UI is, but man is it a good settings menu. I want to address the colors up front. The settings menu is red for me for reasons that are a spoiler? Let's just say normally the menu screen is yellow, and sometimes it's red. When you see anything that's red on this screen, imagine it could also be yellow. Solid red is a color I try to avoid, because my friend who's colorblind sees red as a dark brown. This makes certain parts of this menu somewhat inaccessible and hard to read, but I think generally the menu copes with that problem quite well. Let's talk about these tabs. These tabs are big, distinct, and clear. The currently selected tab is highlighted in a different color, making it obvious which tab you have selected, modulo the color blindness problem I just mentioned. If you hover over a non-selected tab, it inverts the color, hinting that something will happen when you click on it. This is called hover feedback. Anything clickable should have some sort of hover feedback, indicating, yes, I've detected that you're hovering that thing, and if you click it, something will happen. Likewise, if you hover something and get no hover feedback, that lack of reaction should indicate that it's not currently clickable. Each settings widget has a label indicating what it does. The labels are in large print and they're neatly spaced apart. When you hover over any part of the widget, including the label, you get hover feedback for the whole thing. The controls and the label both light up, and there's a little marker giving an extra layer of hover feedback. This is great for checkboxes because it means you can click on any part of the widget and it will toggle the checkbox. Each UI control has a label next to it indicating its current value. This is really useful for sliders because it tells you the exact value, and it's useful for checkboxes as a fallback for the color blindness problem I mentioned earlier. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe has not one, but two separate types of sliders, and they both feel amazing to interact with. The settings sliders have thumbs that get bigger when the widget is hovered. This makes the thumb easier to grab, as well as adding yet another layer of hover feedback. These sliders hit all the edge cases I mentioned before, and they also support the arrow keys for fine-tuning so you can set your FOV just right. Speaking of sliders, a scroll bar is kind of like a slider, but not really. Scrolling with the scroll wheel moves the content a comfortable amount to maintain context without feeling too slow. To scroll, you can either use the scroll wheel, you can grab the thumb and scroll, or you can click anywhere in the scroll bar and it will move the thumb towards that position. If you click on the scroll bar, it takes the thumb to sort of that location. Honestly, this one's a little wonky. It seems to shrink sometimes at the top and bottom. I mean, it works. I could totally imagine that QA found this and they just chose not to fix it because only weirdos like me would notice. I do have one tiny critique, and it's a pretty tiny nitpick, but when I first saw the general settings, it was not obvious to me that this was scrollable. The two ways I could see to fix this is either to brighten up the body of the scroll bar so it's more visible and pronounced as a scroll bar, or mess with the padding such that the next option down is just barely within view, to hint that there's more content down there. Like I said, it's a tiny nitpick. I did eventually figure it out, obviously. Going back into the UI controls, I don't know what to call these things. Multi-menus? Combo menus? As a programmer, I want to call them enum selectors, but no one's gonna get that. They're the control where you pick one thing from a set of many possible things. There are lots of ways to implement this type of control. You could use a radial checkbox, you could use a dropdown, or you could do what Ultra Deluxe does and have left and right buttons to cycle through the options and just show the current option. This is more compact than a radial checkbox, and it doesn't have to deal with the scrolling and layering problems you might encounter with the dropdown. The arrow buttons themselves have 2 layers of hover feedback. They both change in size and they change in color. You'll love to see it. One tiny consequence of this control design is you can't tell how many options you have and what your options are. For instance, if I wanted to play in French, I don't know if French is even supported until I cycle through the options and I either find French or I loop back around to English. This isn't really a critique, but it's an observation of the trade-off the UI designer made here. Let's talk about buttons. So, the short version is, Ultra Deluxe has good buttons, but I did want to rant about bad buttons. How a button is supposed to work is that it detects when you've mouse downed on it, and then it detects that the mouse down had a corresponding mouse up. Once it receives that mouse up, it triggers. It's that simple. Some people get this wrong and have the button just react to a mouse down, which feels really stiff and awkward. Or they have a button that only responds to mouse up, which feels normal up until you get to the edge case where you mouse downed off the button and then mouse up on the button. And then you're in a weird situation where you just pressed a button you didn't press. The good news is Ultra Deluxe has good buttons. These 2 buttons in the settings menu in particular are very consequential buttons. They both involve deleting data that won't be recoverable, and as such they bring up scary warning prompts before you can commit the action. First off, they black out the whole screen and show you big bold white text that's very attention grabbing. These warnings are there to protect you from yourself. They want to funnel you towards the no button because the designer wants to make sure that you understand exactly what you're about to do and make extra sure that you want to do it. This is one of the rare cases where it should take mental energy to press the yes button, and here's how they achieve that. First, the no button is highlighted by default, regardless of where your cursor is, so it already feels like the default option. Second, the no button is on the left, meaning that if you read left to right, then it's the first thing you see. Because the no button is on the left, and the buttons that trigger these prompts are also on the left, it means that most likely when you click this button, your mouse is already either on or very close to the no button. This maximizes the likelihood that if you selected yes, you really meant it. Ultra Deluxe does such a good job with its UI that you don't really notice all the things it's doing right. A year ago, I made another version of this video where instead of praising a game for having great widgets, I tore apart a game for having terrible widgets. And it felt bad. Like I was punching down at developers who were trying their best and just prioritized their primary gameplay loop over making their menus feel just right. But it just makes me happy that a game like Ultra Deluxe can exist that has compelling gameplay and good UI widgets.